The desert of Vorthax stretched beneath a sky bruised with twin suns, each one bleeding gold and crimson into the dunes that rolled like frozen waves of rusted iron. The air shimmered with heat, thick with the scent of ozone and crushed mineral dust, and every gust of wind carried the whisper of ancient sandstorms that had scoured this world clean of life, except for the few who dared to fight on it. Corporal Rian Vel, 23 years old, calloused hands still gripping the worn leather of his rifle strap, stood motionless atop a dune ridge, his breath steady despite the weight of exhaustion pressing down like a physical thing. He was small for a soldier, lean as a desert fox, with dark eyes that had seen too many sunrises in places no human was meant to survive. His uniform was torn at the shoulder, caked in grit, and his helmet had been lost 2 days prior in a skirmish near the ruins of Karveth. He didn't miss it. What he carried instead, strapped across his back in a leather scabbard that had once belonged to his grandfather, was a blade older than the empire that sent him here. A katana, forged in the quiet mountains of Earth's Japan, its edge still sharp after 3 centuries of neglect and now, after 6 months of alien war, still deadly. He had brought it because it was the only thing that felt like home, and because he refused to let his father's legacy be buried under alien sand. Below him, the battlefield was a graveyard of shattered war machines and broken armor. The Zyanthari, the purple-skinned, white-haired alien warriors of the Vorthaxian Dominion, moved with eerie grace through the wreckage, their long limbs gliding over the terrain as if gravity were a suggestion rather than a law. Their skin shimmered like polished amethyst under the twin suns, and their hair, long, silken, and bone-white, flowed behind them like banners of surrender that never came. They were beautiful, in a way that made Rian's stomach twist. Not the beauty of art or peace, but the kind that made you forget you were being hunted. They had no fear, not of death, not of pain, not of the strange, silent human who carried a relic from a dead world. And they laughed. They laughed at his sword. It happened just after the 3rd ambush. Rian had taken out 3 of them with his rifle, 2 with his sidearm, and the last one with the blade clean, swift, a single stroke that severed the spinal column just below the skull. He'd done it without thinking, without pride, just instinct honed by years of training and the quiet rage of losing his squad. When he pulled the sword free, the blood, thick, violet, and smelling faintly of burnt cinnamon, dripped onto the sand. He wiped it on his pant leg, turned, and saw her. Princess Lyra Vaith, daughter of the High Sovereign, heir to the Zyanthari throne, stood at the edge of the wreckage, flanked by 6 armored guards who had frozen mid-step. She was taller than any human, her posture regal even in the midst of battle, her white hair tied back in a single braid that reached her waist. Her eyes, large and luminous like polished moonstone, locked onto the blade in Rian's hand. And then she laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh. Not at first. It was light, musical, almost delighted. A sound that belonged in a palace garden, not a battlefield littered with corpses. Her guards stiffened, confused. One of them lowered his weapon slightly, as if unsure whether to intervene. Lyra stepped forward, her bare feet, pale as moonlit stone, sinking slightly into the sand. She reached out, not to touch the blade, but to gesture at it with a long, elegant finger. "You carry a child's toy," she said, her voice a melody laced with amusement. "Is this what your people worship? A curved piece of metal? You fight with this? And you think it matters?" Rian didn't answer. He just stared at her. He'd heard their language through the translation implants in his skull. Fluent, precise, but always laced with condescension. The Zyanthari saw humans as primitive, emotional, chaotic. They had gravity drives and quantum lances and neural webs that connected entire cities. They had perfected emotion as a science, cataloged it, controlled it. They did not understand why a human would carry a sword into battle when he could fire a pulse rifle from a kilometer away. They did not understand why anyone would choose pain over efficiency. Rian lifted the blade slowly, the sun catching the edge and turning it into a sliver of fire. "It's not about what it does," he said, his voice rough from dust and silence. "It's about what it costs." Lyra tilted her head, intrigued now. "Cost? You mean the time it took to forge it? The mineral resources? The energy expended in polishing it?" "No," Rian said. "I mean the man who held it. The man who died holding it. The man who taught me how to hold it right." She laughed again, softer this time, almost fondly. How sentimental. How human. She turned to her guards. "He thinks the sword is sacred. How quaint." Rian didn't flinch. He didn't raise his weapon. He just stood there, sweat dripping down his temple, his chest heaving, his eyes fixed on hers. And then, without warning, he did something no human soldier was supposed to do. He dropped to one knee. It wasn't surrender. It wasn't submission. It was a challenge. Lyra blinked. Her guards tensed. One of them stepped forward, his plasma rifle humming to life. "Princess," he growled. "He is attempting deception. He is a human. They lie." But Lyra raised a hand, and the guard froze. She stepped closer, until she was barely an arm's length away. The scent of her, something like crushed moonflowers and cold metal, filled the air between them. "You kneel," she said, her voice quieter now, curious. "Why?" "To show you," Rian said, his voice low, steady, "that I am not afraid of you, and that I will not die without making you remember me." She studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, deliberately, she reached out and plucked the katana from his grip. Rian didn't move. He didn't even breathe. Lyra held the blade aloft, turning it slowly, admiring the curve, the worn hilt, the faint etching along the fuller. A single kanji character his grandfather had carved, Ganbaru, to endure. "It is oddly beautiful," she admitted almost to herself. "The craftsmanship is primitive, but the intention is not." She lifted it higher, then, with a flick of her wrist, brought it down in a practiced arc, like a dancer performing a ritual. The blade sliced through the air with a soft shhh. Then it struck the ground. Not the sand. The corpse of a Zuanthari warrior, still warm, still bleeding. The katana, sharp as it was, did not cut through the alien's armored pauldron. It struck the metal with a ringing clang, and the edge, for the first time in centuries, chipped. A tiny sliver of steel, no larger than a grain of salt, flew off and landed in the dust. Lyra froze. Her eyes widened. Not in anger, not in fear, in disbelief. She stared at the blade, then at the armor, then back at the chip. You broke it?" she whispered. Rian didn't smile. He didn't need to. He rose slowly to his feet, brushing sand from his knees. "No," he said. "You did." Lyra looked at him then, not as a soldier, not as a curiosity, not as a primitive, but as something she had never encountered before. Something that did not obey the rules of logic. Something that carried pain like a crown. "You think this makes you stronger?" she asked. "I think," Rian said, "that you've never held something that meant more to you than your own life." She turned away, her expression unreadable. She handed the blade back to him. He took it without speaking. The weight of it felt different now. Heavier. Truer. She ordered her guards to retreat. The battlefield fell silent except for the wind and the distant crackle of dying plasma fire. Rian didn't know why she spared him. He didn't care. He walked away. 3 days later he found her again. Not in battle. Not in the ruins of the old city. But in the heart of the Zuanthari supply camp, hidden beneath a canopy of woven silk and floating lanterns that glowed with bioluminescent algae. She was alone. She had shed her armor. Wore instead a flowing robe of silver-threaded fabric that clung to her form like liquid starlight. Her hair was loose, cascading over her shoulders, catching the light of the lanterns like spun glass. She sat cross-legged on a low dais, surrounded by scrolls and data crystals, her fingers tracing patterns in the air as if reading the wind. Rian didn't announce himself. He didn't need to. She knew he was there before he took his third step. "You are persistent," she said without looking up. "I'm not leaving," he replied. She glanced at him then, her expression unreadable. "Why?" "Because you didn't kill me. I could have. You didn't." She set down the crystal and stood. Walked toward him, barefoot, silent. The air between them crackled, not with electricity, but with something older. Something unspoken. "You carry a weapon that cannot pierce our armor," she said. "You fight with tools your ancestors used before the stars were mapped." "Why?" "Because I don't fight to win," he said. "I fight to remember." She stopped. "Remember what?" "That we are more than our machines." She stared at him. For a long time she said nothing. Then, softly, she asked, "Do you believe I do not remember?" Rian didn't answer right away. He looked around the chamber. The delicate carvings on the walls, the way the lanterns moved in perfect unison, the scent of incense that smelled like grief and memory. He saw the way her fingers trembled slightly when she reached for a cup of tea, something she had brewed herself, from dried petals and crushed moonroot. He saw the way her eyes lingered on the katana, still strapped to his back. As if it were a ghost she couldn't forget. "You don't remember," he said quietly. "You've forgotten what it means to feel something without measuring it." She turned away, walked to the window. The twin suns were setting now, painting the desert in hues of violet and molten copper. "We do not feel," she said. "We calculate. We optimize. Emotion is inefficient. It leads to error, to loss." "Then why do you keep this place?" Rian asked. "Why the lanterns? The incense? The tea?" She didn't answer. He stepped closer. "Your people don't cry. But you do, don't you? When you think no one's looking." She stiffened. "You lost someone," he said. "Didn't you?" Silence. Then, so softly he almost didn't hear it, "My brother." Rian didn't move, didn't speak. "He was the one who taught me to hold a blade," she whispered. "Not a plasma cutter, not a neural lance. A real sword, Catter, made of forged steel. He said it was the only way to learn what fear felt like. He said if you could stand still with a blade at your throat and not blink, then you understood honor." She turned to him, her eyes glistening. Not with tears, but with something worse. The memory of them. "He died when the humans attacked the Sky Spire," she said. "They used a gravity bomb. He was holding the shield generator. He didn't run. He didn't scream. He just held on. Until the last second." Rian swallowed. He was brave. Lyra looked at him, and for the first time her voice cracked. He was foolish. Rian reached out, not to touch her, not to comfort her, but to point to the katana on his back. "My grandfather fought in the lunar uprising," he said. "He carried this blade through 3 wars. He never fired a single shot with it. He said the sword wasn't for killing. It was for reminding yourself that you're still human, that you still choose, even when the world tells you to surrender." Lyra stared at him. Her breath came slow, uneven. You think I have forgotten how to choose?" "I think you've been taught that choosing is weakness," Rian said. "But I've seen you. You keep his memory here, in this room, in this tea, in the way you touch the lanterns like they're alive. You haven't forgotten. You're just afraid to feel it." She turned away again, walked to the center of the chamber, stood perfectly still. Then, without warning, she reached behind her back and pulled free a blade. Not a plasma weapon, not a laser, not a neural lance. Catter, identical in shape to the one her brother had wielded. She held it out to him. "Teach me," she said. Rian didn't move. "Teach me," she repeated, louder this time. "Teach me how to hold something that matters more than my life." He took the blade. It was lighter than he expected. The hilt was wrapped in woven silk, the edge dull with age but still deadly. He turned it slowly in his hands, feeling the balance, the weight, the memory of the man who once held it. He looked at her. "You don't learn to hold a sword," he said. "You learn to hold yourself." He stepped toward her, not as a soldier, not as a conqueror, as a teacher. He took her wrist gently, not with force, but with care, and placed her fingers around the hilt. "First," he said, "you breathe." She did, slowly, deeply. "Then," he said, "you stop thinking about winning." He moved behind her, close enough that she could feel his breath on her neck. "You think about standing." He guided her arms into position. Not to strike, not to defend, to be. She trembled. "Your brother," he whispered, "didn't die because he was weak. He died because he chose to be something bigger than his fear." She closed her eyes. Tears fell, not from sadness, from recognition. The next morning, the Zyanthari command discovered that the princess had vanished. No alarm was raised. No search was ordered. Because no one believed she had left willingly. They assumed she had been captured. Or worse, they sent patrols, drones, recon ships. They found nothing. Until, 3 days later, a scout unit stumbled upon a single silent figure standing atop the ridge of the shattered dunes. It was Lyra. She wore no armor, no insignia, just the silver robe, her white hair loose in the wind. And in her hands she held a blade. Not her brother's Catter, not Rian's katana, but a new one, forged from the alloy of a Zyanthari plasma lance and the steel of Rian's sword. Fusion, a hybrid, a weapon that did not exist before. She stood perfectly still, facing the horizon where the suns met the sand. Behind her, kneeling on one knee, his face streaked with dust and dried blood, his uniform torn beyond repair, sat Corporal Rian Vel. He had not moved in 3 hours. He had not eaten. He had not slept. He had been teaching her, not how to fight, but how to be. The Zyanthari scouts froze. They did not fire. They did not speak. They simply watched. Because what they saw was not a human and an alien. It was something else. Something that had never been seen on Vorthax before. A teacher, a student, and a blade that had learned to sing. The desert changed after that. Not overnight. Not with a battle. But with a whisper. Rian didn't return to his unit. He didn't report to command. He didn't even ask for extraction. He stayed. And Lyra didn't return to her throne. She stayed too. She began to walk the dunes alone, every morning before sunrise, practicing the movements he taught her. She didn't speak to her guards. She didn't answer their questions. She just walked, and swung, and breathed. And slowly, the other Zyanthari began to notice. At first, it was the elders. The ones who remembered the old ways before the Dominion became a machine of efficiency. They saw her practicing and said nothing. But they began to gather, quietly, at the edge of the dunes, watching. Then the soldiers, not the officers, the ones who had lost brothers, sisters, friends. They saw her, this princess, this daughter of the throne, standing in the sand, sweating, bleeding, falling, rising again. And they remembered what it felt like to feel. One night, a young soldier, barely older than Rian, approached her as she practiced under the stars. He held out his hand. "May I?" he asked. She looked at him, then at the blade in her hands. She nodded. He took the catter, and began to move. Not perfectly, not gracefully, but with something real. The next morning there were 5 of them, then 10, then 100. They didn't train with their plasma lances. They trained with swords, forged from scrap metal, repurposed armor, old weapons buried in the ruins. They didn't know how to use them, but they knew how to feel, and that was enough. The Dominion's High Sovereign sent an ultimatum. He demanded Lyra's return. He ordered Rian's execution. He threatened to burn the dunes to ash. Lyra didn't respond. She simply walked into the central plaza of the abandoned city of Vorthax Prime, where the old Zyanthari archives had once stood. She stood before the massive stone monolith that bore the imperial seal, the symbol of absolute control. And she raised her blade, not to strike, but to carve. With the edge of the fusion sword, she etched a new symbol into the stone. A circle. Inside it, a blade. And beneath it, 2 words. In Zyanthari script. And in ancient human kanji. Ganbaru. The next day, the entire Zyanthari army, tens of thousands of warriors, stood before the monolith. Not in formation, not in silence, but in a circle, each one holding a blade. Some crude, some beautiful, all real. Lyra stepped forward. She turned to Rian. He was standing behind her, silent, exhausted, his eyes heavy with the weight of 1,000 sunsets. She reached out and took his hand, not as a princess to a soldier, not as an alien to a human, but as 2 people who had learned, in the middle of a desert, in the shadow of war, that some things cannot be calculated, that some things are worth dying for, that some things are worth living for. The High Sovereign's fleet arrived 3 days later. They came with cannons, with gravity disruptors, with drones that could vaporize a city block. They expected resistance. They expected fear. They expected surrender. What they found was a desert, filled with warriors, holding blades, and a human man, and a purple-skinned princess, who stood together, and smiled, not in triumph, not in defiance, but in peace, because they had finally remembered what it meant to be alive. The fleet opened fire. The first blast tore through the eastern dunes, sending a plume of sand and fire into the sky. But the Zyanthari did not run. They did not raise their weapons. They simply raised their blades, and they began to sing, a song older than the stars, a song of breath, of blood, of choice. Rian stood beside Lyra, his hand still in hers. He didn't know if they would live. He didn't know if the Dominion would crush them. He didn't care, because for the first time in his life he wasn't fighting to survive. He was fighting to be remembered. And as the plasma fire rained down from the sky, as the ground cracked beneath them, as the sky burned with the wrath of a dying empire, Lyra whispered something he would carry with him for the rest of his life. She said, "Thank you." And then, together, they stepped forward, not to fight, not to flee, but to meet the storm. And the desert, for the first time in centuries, held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The plasma fire rained down, searing the sky into jagged streaks of cobalt and white, but the blast never touched the ground. Instead, a shimmering dome, translucent, pulsing with faint silver light, rose from the dunes like a breath held too long. It rippled outward, swallowing the inferno before it could scorch a single grain of sand. The Dominion fleet recoiled in the heavens, their targeting systems flickering, confused. No Zyanthari vessel had ever deployed a shield of that kind. It wasn't technological. It wasn't energy-based. It was something older. Lyra's eyes glowed with the same soft silver as the barrier. "The ancestors," she whispered, her voice trembling not with fear but reverence. "They're answering." Rian stared at the dome, then at her. "You knew." "I hoped," she admitted. "The songs, they weren't just memory. They were a key." The truth crashed over him like a wave. The Zyanthari had not always been a race of cold logic. Once, long before the rise of the Dominion, they had worshipped the dunes, spoke to the stars, and wielded blades not as relics but as conduits of will. The Empire had buried that past beneath layers of efficiency and calculation, branding it irrational. But the desert remembered, and the desert had waited. Above, the Dominion flagship, the Sovereign's Wrath, shuddered as its weapons failed one by one. Alarms blared across its command deck, where High Sovereign Vaith, Lyra's own father, stood rigid in his obsidian robes, his white hair braided with chains of command, his face, usually carved from ice, now twisted with something unfamiliar. Not rage, but dread. "She awakened the veil," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "She brought back the old ways." His chief advisor, a skeletal elder named Zorlin, stepped forward, his voice sharp. "She is corrupted by the human. Execute her. Purge the anomaly." But the sovereign didn't answer. He stared down at the planet below, his daughter, standing hand in hand with the enemy, bathed in silver light, and for the first time in centuries he hesitated. On the ground, the Zyanthari warriors lowered their blades. Not in surrender, but in awe. The dome pulsed again, and from the heart of the dunes, something rose. A spire, not of metal or stone, of living crystal. It spiraled upward, humming with harmonic resonance, its surface etched with the same ancient symbols Lyra had carved into the monolith. As it grew, the air changed. The twin suns dimmed. A third light, a soft violet moon, began to glow on the horizon, though none had ever existed there before. "The third eye," Lyra breathed. "The lost moon of Vorthax." It was never gone. It was sleeping. Rian felt the ground tremble beneath his boots. Not from bombardment, but from awakening. He turned to her. "What happens now?" "Now," she said, her voice steady despite the tears tracing paths down her purple cheeks. "My people remember who they are." But the Dominion was not done. From the belly of the Sovereign's Wrath, 10 drop pods erupted sleek, black, humming with neural suppression fields. They slammed into the sands just beyond the dome's edge, cracking open to reveal not soldiers, but something far worse. Nullborn. Genetically altered Zyanthari, stripped of emotion, memory, even pain. Their eyes were hollow, their skin a dull gray, their hair shorn to the scalp. They moved in perfect unison, their limbs jerking like puppets on invisible strings. Their only purpose, erase, not kill. Erase through psychic resonance that could unravel a mind from the inside out. The dome flickered. The Nullborn advanced. Lyra's warriors raised their blades again, but this time, fear flickered in their eyes. These were not enemies they could fight with steel. These were ghosts of what they might have become. Rian tightened his grip on the fusion blade. "Stay behind me." "No," Lyra said, stepping forward. "This is my burden." She walked toward the Nullborn, unarmed. "Lyra," Rian started, but she raised a hand. "They are not monsters. They are victims, like I was." She stopped 10 paces from the nearest Nullborn, who tilted its head like a bird of prey. Then, softly, she began to sing. Not the war chant, not the blade hymn, but a lullaby. Her voice, clear and trembling, floated over the dunes. It spoke of starlight caught in white hair, of twin suns warming purple skin, of a brother who once held her hand and said, "You are more than your duty." The Nullborn froze. One by one, their heads lifted. Their hollow eyes flickered. not with recognition, but with the faintest glimmer of memory. A tear rolled down the face of the lead nullborn. Then another. Then they collapsed, not dead, but awake. Their gray skin began to flush back to violet. Their cropped scalps itched as white hairs pushed through. The Dominion had tried to erase emotion, but the desert had given it back. On the flagship, the Sovereign watched through the view screen. His hands, usually steady, trembled. Zorlin turned to him, his voice cold. "Sire, order the orbital lance. Burn it all." The Sovereign looked at his daughter below. No longer a disobedient heir, but something greater, a bridge. He turned to Zorlin. "You call her corrupted, but who corrupted us?" And with a voice that shattered centuries of silence, he gave his final command. "Lower all weapons. Broadcast this across the fleet. Stand down." Zorlin's eyes widened in horror. Treason. The Sovereign drew a ceremonial dagger from his belt. Not a neural lance, but a true blade, its edge dulled by time. "You will not speak of my daughter again," he said, and with one swift motion, he severed Zorlin's neural implant from his spine. The advisor fell, screaming. Not in pain, but in terror at feeling real pain for the first time. Below, Lyra and Rian watched as the Dominion fleet powered down, their weapons darkening like dying stars. But the peace was short-lived. From the eastern dunes, where the oldest ruins lay buried beneath sandstorms and silence, a new presence stirred. Not Zyanthari, not human, something else. A ship, jagged, obsidian black, shaped like a scorpion's tail, rose from the sands, its hull humming with frequencies that made the crystal spire scream. Its markings were unknown, its language unreadable even by Lyra's translators. The Void Reapers, ancient nomads of deep space, harvesters of dying civilizations. They had watched the war from the shadows, waiting for both sides to weaken each other. Now, with the Dominion broken and the Zyanthari reborn but vulnerable, they struck. Their cannons fired not plasma, not lasers, but entropy beams, weapons that aged matter on contact. A single shot turned a dune to dust, a warrior to ash, a blade to rust. The silver dome shattered. The crystal spire cracked. Lyra cried out as the third eye dimmed. Rian pulled her back. "We can't fight this. We don't have to," she said, her eyes locking onto his. "We just have to choose." She turned to her people, now a mix of awakened Zyanthari, former nullborn, and scattered human survivors who had joined them during the siege. "We do not fight as soldiers," she declared. "We fight as people." And then she did something no Zyanthari had done in millennia. She knelt, not in submission, but in invitation. One by one, her warriors knelt beside her. Then the humans. Then even the former nullborn. They placed their blades on the sand, not as weapons but as offerings. The crystal spire pulsed weakly. Rian drew his katana one last time. He looked at Lyra, then at the approaching Reaper ship, its maw opening for a final, annihilating blast. He knelt, and laid his blade beside hers. The moment steel touched sand, the desert roared. Not with wind, with power. Every blade, human, Zyanthari, hybrid, began to glow, their edges humming in unison. The sand itself rose in spirals, weaving around the warriors like protective serpents. The cracked spire flared with blinding light, and the third eye, now fully risen, cast a beam of violet energy straight into the heart of the Reaper ship. The entropy cannons backfired. The ship folded in on itself, collapsing into a singularity no larger than a pebble before vanishing with a sound like a sigh. Silence returned, but it was a different silence. Not the silence of death, but of awe. Lyra stood. So did Rian. Their hands found each other again, not out of habit, but necessity. Above, the Dominion fleet began to descend, not to conquer, but to rejoin. The Sovereign stepped onto the sands first, his ceremonial blade still in hand. He walked to his daughter, his eyes wet with something he had not felt in 200 years. "You were right," he said simply. She bowed her head. "I only remembered what you taught me before the Empire took you." He embraced her then, awkwardly at first, then fiercely, like a man reclaiming a part of his soul. Rian watched, his chest tight. He had come to this desert as a soldier with nothing but a sword and a name. Now he stood as something else. A teacher, a witness, a thread in a tapestry far older than war. But the universe was not done with them. From the remains of the Reaper ship, a single object tumbled through the air. A small obsidian orb, pulsing with red light. It landed at Rian's feet. He picked it up, Instantly visions flooded his mind. Galaxies burning, ancient races falling. A pattern of destruction so vast it made the Dominion War look like a spark. Lyra touched his arm. "What is it?" "A warning," he whispered. "Or a map." She looked at the orb, then at the stars. "They're coming, aren't they?" He nodded. The Reapers weren't alone. They were scouts. The Sovereign joined them, his voice grim. "Then we prepare." But Lyra shook her head. "No, we don't prepare for war. We prepare for connection." She turned to the gathered crowd. Zuanthari, humans, former enemies now standing as one. "We will not build bigger weapons," she declared. "We will build bridges. We will find others like us, those who still remember how to feel. And we will stand together." Rian looked at her, this princess who had laughed at his sword and now carried its spirit in her soul, and he smiled. The desert stretched before them, endless and scarred, but alive. And for the first time in a long time, the future did not look like a battlefield. It looked like a beginning. The orb pulsed gently in Rian's hand, no longer a threat, but a key, its red light softening to gold as the twin suns kissed the horizon. Lyra pressed her forehead to his, not in ceremony, but in quiet understanding. The Zuanthari did not cheer. They did not roar. They simply stood, blades still in the sand, hearts finally open, breathing as one. The Sovereign knelt beside them, not as ruler but as father, and placed his hand over theirs. The Nullborn, now whole, wept without shame. Human survivors from the war's wreckage rose from the dunes, their uniforms torn but their spirits whole, and joined hands with those who had once been their enemies. The crystal spire, now whole again, sang a song only the desert remembered, a melody of roots, wind, and stars. From its heart, a single seed of living light drifted down, landing in the sand between them. It sprouted instantly, a slender tree with silver leaves and violet blossoms, its roots threading deep into the bones of Vorthax. That night, for the first time in centuries, the Zuanthari lit no war lanterns. They lit candles, handmade, waxed from desert bees, wicks woven from human wool and Zuanthari silk. They told stories, of brothers lost, of sisters found, of swords that didn't cut, but remembered. Rian taught children how to hold a blade, not to kill, but to carve names into stone. Lyra taught elders how to laugh again, loud and unguarded, until the dunes echoed with joy. A year passed. Then too, the Dominion became the Dawn Concord, a union of worlds not by force but by choice. Ships no longer carried weapons. They carried seeds, books, songs. Humans and Zuanthari walked side by side on the moons of distant stars, teaching others how to feel without fear. The orb? It became the Heartstone, placed beneath the blossoming tree in the center of the new city Vorthax Prime, now called Ganbaru. Rian never returned to Earth. He didn't need to. Home wasn't a place anymore. It was the hand that held his when the wind grew cold. It was the sound of Lyra humming as she sharpened her blade each morning. It was the way the children called him Uncle Rian, even though he wasn't their uncle at all. Lyra never took the throne. Instead, she became the first listener, someone who sat with the grieving, the lost, the afraid, and simply held space for their pain. On the day their daughter was born, the tree bloomed with 1,000 new flowers. The sky turned violet. The wind carried a whisper, not in any language, but in feeling. They named her Serial, meaning God's song. She was born with silver eyes and white hair, just like her mother. And when she took her first steps, she reached for her father's sword, not to wield it, but to rest her tiny hand upon it, as if to say, "I know you." Rian picked her up. Lyra kissed his cheek. The desert, once silent, now sang. And for the first time since the stars began, no one felt alone. They were not conquerors. They were not survivors. They were simply together. And that, more than any weapon, any empire, any star, was the greatest victory of all.